Hi guys, how are you? So nice to connect to you. So welcome to this video and welcome to this show. My name is Laura. This is Pleiadian Healer and working through the distractions since day one, right? But today we're going to actually be talking about something that's very different from the normal content. I do think there will be a few more videos up on this topic. And we already had one quite recently. I also had a few from back in the day, like 2 years ago. But the one from quite recently was more about Jeshua's birthday and a few other facts. So today we're going to be talking about Jesus, also known as Jeshua. Jesus is just a name that was given to him later on, like hundreds of years later. And I do think it's important to tell the story, at least the real story or the information that I've read on so far, because everything has been distorted and everything that you read on, especially like in the Bible or the scriptures, has been written like decades after this person supposedly existed. It's also written by mankind, by people, so everything's been distorted no matter what, right? Like we already know it. Like everyone knows how it's like when you hear something a friend tells you and then you tell another friend, and then like 10 friends down the line, you know, the entire story already changed completely. So I think that's definitely part of what happened with the scriptures or everything that's out there. You know, I mean, mainstream is a different example, but I do think that a lot of these stories are also planted. And what was so interesting is because once you start doing a little bit more research, you know, on certain dates and topics and everything, the algorithms pick up on what you're searching for. And so all of a sudden I had all these movies pop up, you know, Jesus of so-and-so and so-and-so and this and that. And I watched one movie. It was a mainstream movie that was released a few years ago. And my goodness, everything was distorted in that one. Like I think I could only see 3 minutes of it until I was like, off. I can't watch this anymore. Like this was very clearly also designed by a man, not a woman. You can definitely tell the style in which the movie was shot. Not that there's something bad about it, don't get me wrong, but it's just very distorted. Like the entire story made no sense to me. So what are we going to start off with? I think in this specific video, and I have my notes here and everything, so I'm just going to read from my notes. We're going to talk about Jesus' real life. So when I say Jesus, I mean Jeshua. That's his actual name, okay? I mean, we had a video already like on his past lives and future life, or the lives that followed, you know, possibly his future lives too, because every like time is so messed up with. But what we want to focus on is his family, his wedding to Mary Magdalene, very important. Who was he as a person? And possibly the corruption of his soul in other lifetimes as well. So, did Jesus really exist? So, first of all, did these people really exist? Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Virgin Mary, Joseph the father. So yeah, in short, yes. Otherwise their story wouldn't be distorted left and right the way it is. You know, you have to kind of see it this way. There's always like a grain of truth, a grain of salt or whatever in every story that they're kind of showing us, but especially the Jesus one. And just the way they're blowing it up all over, you know, it's been blown up for thousands of years. Like, I mean, we don't really know how long it's been. You know, some people are like 2,000 years. Some people are like, it's only been like 500 years ago because they kind of erased parts of our history and everything. But however long it's been, even if it's only been 500 years, even if it's been 2,000 years or longer, yes, I do think this person existed, to be honest with you. And I do think the aspect of persecution, like that there was a group that was actually persecuted and, you know, crucified or hung or whatever, was definitely there. Was the story the way that you see it in the Bible or the way that you see it in movies nowadays? Yes and no. There's a little bit of grain of salt truth in that too. But yeah, we're going to focus, first of all, we're going to start off with Jesus. Who was he as a person? Who was Jeshua as a person? What I want to point out And this is, very different from other people because you see that, first of all, we're still in the Easter portal. Okay. So if you celebrated Easter, happy Easter. If you celebrated Passover, happy Passover. And then there's also a Muslim holiday occurring right now. And then I read somewhere it happens only once every 33 years, that all of those three religions kind of coincide right now in their holiday that are similar to Easter. So very special portal anyhow, so with all these portals, a lot of harvesting is occurring. And so just be prepared for that. I've been having a headache for the past 2.5 days or so. It's been very hard to record any type of video, to actually even get ready in front of a video. So I know this in and of itself is already very important, because they wouldn't be throwing all of this at us if it weren't. And it's also been very fidgety and fuzzy, like a lot of people around me in the vicinity and everything. It's just, it's been very difficult. Let's put it that way. And just the amount of distractions that are even going on during this video already says a lot. So back to Joshua, back to Jesus. I'm just going to say Jesus, because it's easier. This is not going to be a religious video. Okay. I have religious videos out there where I dissect the religion trap and how religion and the New Age is one and the same thing. It's both a cult, people who go to church, people who pray to angels, archangels, and the New Age, it's one and the same thing. All right. Like for me, it's one and the same thing. I know there are slight differences. I know people think there's salvation in religion, and in the New Age, they think they're going to ascend to 5D. But the concept of heaven and the concept of new earth is the same thing. All right. So this is not a religious video. This is not a New Age video. These are plain, straight facts, psychic facts that I've collected over the past few years already, because I personally am very interested in the subject. I don't think anyone has ever put connections together that I've put together, especially with the past life video that I have out there. I do want to have another video just kind of condensing all of that information again, because the one from 2 years ago is a bit longer. But, in short, I don't think anyone has ever seen a connection between the Tudor regime and Jesus or Joshua, and the connection is definitely there, because Jesus is all over the Tudor regime. All right, just to give you a little bit of that background. So when people talk about Jesus and when people talk about Mary Magdalene, what I don't see so far is the connection. So that, other people are talking about either or. You cannot talk about Joshua, you cannot talk about Jesus, and you cannot talk about Mary Magdalene without talking about another. Both of them belong together. Talking about Jesus and not mentioning Mary Magdalene is like mentioning Mary Magdalene and not talking about Jesus. So when you have all these people, channelers, New Agers, or religious people, whatever, saying they believe they're Jesus or they believe they're Mary Magdalene, my first instinct is always, where's like someone, there's so many women out there who are like, oh, I'm Mary Magdalene. Okay, so I'm always like, where's your Jesus? Because without your Jesus, you are not Mary Magdalene. Like both belong together. Okay, so you cannot be an incarnation of Mary Magdalene without actually having your Jesus somewhere. And usually those people don't have a Jesus. They're like, oh, Jesus already passed away in my life, or it was like a former husband or whatever. No, that's not true. And the same goes with Jesus. Jesus would not be here without his Mary Magdalene. So it's very important to notice. Do I think they're incarnated here at this time? I think so, to be honest with you. But I also think a lot of other powerful people are incarnated. Take Cleopatra, a very powerful incarnation. Take all of the kings and queens that existed in the medieval ages, everything, which existed way before, in the Greek god and goddess program. Joshua and Mary Magdalene and Virgin Mary and Joseph are not the only people that mattered. You had King David, you had Goliath, you had all of these people mentioned in the Bible, which they do exist. You had Esther, you had Ruth, you had all of these people, Abraham, Noah, all these people. I think they're all reincarnated right now at this point in time. So Jesus is not the only person who matters, just to kind of get that program away from people too. But these are powerful souls, and a lot of them are souls. Not all of them are souls, but a lot are souls. I do think Jesus, Jeshua is a soul. I do think Mary Magdalene's a soul. I do think King David's a soul. And I do think for a lot of these people too, by the way, there is a connection to Israel, meaning King David could be incarnated as a Jewish person, for example, maybe not necessarily in Israel. It could be somewhere in a Jewish area in the world, and so on. Okay. So it's not necessarily that way. It doesn't mean that Jesus is a Jewish person or whatever. No, it doesn't really work that way either. But I do think for a lot of them, there is that connection somehow. Okay. But there were so many powerful souls. So just to get back to the topic of Jesus though. So who was Jesus as a person? Jeshua was compassionate, he was loving, and he was kind in that incarnation. He had incarnations, specifically one in the Tudor regime where he maybe would not be seen that way, where people would maybe even call him a bit crazy. He had other incarnations. I think he was mostly in most incarnations, to be honest with you. I do think he was compassionate, kind, and loving, but there were definitely some incarnations where, due to societal expectations or just how people were, cultural expectations or whatever, where he would maybe be seen as cruel later on, like hundreds of years later, or maybe even during that time. But I think it has to do more with, that's just how people were. I mean, look at Mary Antoinette, for example. And I don't think Mary Antoinette is an incarnation of Mary Magdalene, but look at her, for example, like them doing that to the people and everything. And then some people still liked them, some people didn't, so it's kind of like that, it's not necessarily like chopping people's head off or having your head chopped off. It's just kind of that was what kind of happened during the times. So he was someone who loved children as well. Absolutely. He was a person who would absolutely love kids for whatever reason. I haven't really figured out why exactly that is. Some people like kids, some people don't. Some people like pets, some people don't. So I don't really know what's behind that entire child craziness. I don't think it has to do with him being a PEDO either, by the way. I think there's a pure connection somehow. He had unconditional love for a lot of people. Did we used to live in the goddess program? That's something that kind of came up in between while I was reading on it. That's basically the entire Isis, Osiris, Zeus, Apollo, like the entire Roman and Greek god and goddess program, in addition to the Egyptian program. And, did other souls kind of enter after that? And that's how we all got kind of mixed up in this world, and with a lot of background characters too. So I do think around Jeshua's time, there were already a lot of background characters, because when he was basically preaching to the crowds and when he was crucified as well, there were a lot of bystanders. And even in one of his preaches or, whatever, like speeches, there was this one time where he was like, I don't feel people are hearing me at all. Like someone had actually gotten that. It was like 2 years ago when I came across that. He was basically like, I don't feel people are hearing me. They're standing there, but they can't hear me. So that's a very clear indication that he was already dealing with clones or robotoids or background characters, like people, I hate to say it, but people who really don't matter. People are just kind of filling up this world and crowding it, making it more crowded to kind of mix up everyone and the souls, and to kind of get the souls further apart from each other, or to kind of be like, we don't even know who's a soul anymore at this point, unless you're really good in differentiating. Okay, I can see a soul in your eyes, you're a soul. Ooh, I see that's a robotoid. I mean, it takes a lot to really, see that on a daily basis. I see that myself in my life, when I interact with people. Like, it just takes so much energy from you too. But he was already experiencing that. So I'm kind of wondering, because in previous incarnations, I do think they were incarnated as gods and goddesses, by the way, that you didn't have that issue where you didn't have as many background characters, let's put it that way. And so it was easier for the souls to kind of stick together. Like all the souls that are mentioned in the scriptures are basically souls. There was a blind man in Jesus' life. And I have the feeling that this blind man was part of a whole nother group. So it's kind of like there was an overlap between all these souls somehow, or even like the clone bodies, robotoids, and Jeshua, where, Jeshua was going through different stages in his life. So one of the stages was the Essenes and John the Baptist, which I have a video out there on John the Baptist. And he's basically a plagiarizer, a dark magician, and someone who could, definitely a connection to the giants. Not that that's a bad thing, because I also feel Mary Magdalene and Jeshua have a connection to the giants. But with John the Baptist, it's very clear, especially in other incarnations, because he just has that huge giant whatever. It's kind of what I saw in visions, at least, like just giant everything, jaws, face, whatever. So John, the Essenes, Jesus and the Essenes, it's a small part of his life, but it's not everything of his life. He had different parts of his life. I do think the carpenter one was also a part of it. I feel like working with his hands was kind of important in that life somehow. Whether it was a carpenter or something similar to it, for me, it doesn't really matter. Like, it's kind of, he had different stages of his life, and that was before he met Mary Magdalene too. So the Essenes were a part of it. John the Baptist, in my opinion, was not a good person. Definitely not in other incarnations. And that incarnation in specific, just a lot of ego, I think. I feel a lot of people were dealing with ego for sure, and maybe still are too. So we had the blind man in Jesus' life. Could have been part of another group, maybe like rebels. Jesus was not the only person who was persecuted during that time. And so just like he wasn't the only person being crucified during that time either, there were at least like 2 more people or whatever, however that story goes. But there were a lot of different groups. And so there was a blind man, it's just people crossing paths, all these souls and all these like people crossing paths, and how that would occur, in our life right now too. That's why we know each other, because of past life karma and everything. But yeah, there was a whole nother group, could be a group of rebels. And what are they rebelling against? Basically, like the entire Roman Empire thing. That was definitely very significant. I do think that Jeshua has that connection to the Roman Empire, also known as Italy, in other lifetimes somehow. There is a very strong connection to the family of, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Medicis, and then Medicis. I think that's how you pronounce it. So there's a huge connection to the house of the Medicis. Was he a part of that? I'm not sure. He could have been a part of just a different house too. But there is a form of connection. There's actually this one person, and I'm pretty sure she thinks she's Mary Magdalene, who, she channels like all this stuff on Mary Magdalene. But what's interesting to me is, so first of all, she got the birth date of Jesus wrong, which is fine. It's just entities in her field telling her it was March 3rd or whatever, which is not. Because his birth date is August, September. He's a Virgo in that lifetime, at least. But what was interesting is she has a website, she put on her website that she has that connection to the Medicis. And I was like, yeah, there is a connection somehow. I don't think that he was a part of it. And this is a powerful house. This is like, I think they were merchants or something like that. This is a like very dark magic house too, in a way, by the way. And I want to do more research on them, because they're a bit different than the Tudors, for example. There's a different underlying energy to it. But I forgot what I wanted to say. See, this is how they constantly, they've been constant distractions during this video. It's been very hard to record this video. There's stuff going on in the background, but this is how they get you. It's something important to talk about, and this is how they get you. And it's really starting to get a bit upsetting, because this is a topic that people have to know about. So I'm not sure he was a part of that house. He could have been around during the same time, which I think that was around the 1300s. I did get a past life of him being a different type of merchant or whatever, and it had to do with northern Italy. but with the D Medici's, and this one channeler, yeah, this is what I want to say. So this one channeler who thinks she's Mary Magdalene, she can't show a Jesus, and that's the problem. And that's how you know they're not Mary Magdalene. If they can't show their Jesus in their life, they're not Mary Magdalene. I'm sorry to say. There are also all these other women out there who already have children with other men and all of this, and with karmic connections or whatever, and then they meet their divine counterpart and yada yada. No, that's not Mary Magdalene's path. I'm sorry to say that. But, you know, I think there is definitely a program running, because a lot of people also think they're Jeshua. Like there was this one guy in Australia who had like this entire cult around him, and, you know, he's Jeshua, and then his other wife or whatever was Mary Magdalene. There is a program running somehow that keeps people in this loop, that they need to believe that they are this person, and then kind of just zap in a whole lot of people. So what I thought was interesting when I saw these movies too was the entire way people spoke. It's kind of like la, 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 like we're preaching to a crowd and everything. I do think people really talked that way back then, and I think that's running through a lot of souls right now still, who believe they're either or that or whatever. And so I do think people actually really talk that way, you know, in this really elaborate manner in front of, you know, like a crowd and everything back in the day. So it's interesting to see that kind of come out in people nowadays too. Like not much has changed within the 2,000 years or 500 years or however long it's been, right? So during Easter, during Christmas, the Christ program is basically activated. For Mary Magdalene, the program for her is usually activated around July 22nd. A lot of New Agers feel they have to like pray to Mary Magdalene or celebrate her feast day and everything. Even though there's not a whole lot. I mean, it's just a random date they chose, I feel. And even her birthday, I mean, it's just, yeah, there's so much random stuff where they're trying to just zap you into all these portals, you know, similar to the Lionsgate portal and everything too. So Easter, Christmas, and a few other dates in the year are all of these programs that are surrounding Jeshua and also Mary Magdalene. Now, so Jesus real life. Okay, so Jesus was born to Joseph and Virgin Mary. I do believe that very strongly. First of all, there is a connection to the giants. Mary Magdalene definitely has that connection. She could have been a descendant from the giant lineage, and Jesus too. I do think they were larger than normal. Maybe not in that lifetime, but other lifetimes, because they did reincarnate over and over again, before and after. Virgin Mary and Joseph, I'm not really sure how old Virgin Mary was when she met Joseph, or because there are like different theories out there. She could have been like very young, and he could have been like 90 plus years old, which if he was really that old, that kind of already shows his giant lineage, let's put it that way, that he was able to turn like hundreds of years old. But whatever, Virgin Mary, Joseph, I think they would be very much in the program, meaning not really questioning their life. So just very simple people, maybe very religious people as well, which back then the religion that they were following was, you know, Judaism or whatever. And that's kind of why the entire family was persecuted as well. So they were persecuted first when they had to like flee to Egypt and come back. That's kind of like part of the story, how baby Jesus came to Egypt. Whether or not it's true, I think there's a little bit of truth behind it. I'm not sure if it's really happened exactly that way, how the Bible wants us to make believe, but there is a connection between Egypt and Jesus, which I want to explain later too. So that family was persecuted in a way, and then kind of come back. There was something holy about that part of the land, and that's also why the land nowadays, you know, you look at Israel, you look at Palestine, you look at Iraq, Iran, everything is very much under control. Was going through a lot of wars and everything too. Sorry, someone's like playing in the background with toys and everything. So just the reason there's a lot of conflict in that, you know, Gaza Strip and all of those strips, the Middle East in general, is just because it's not just because of Jesus, but, you know, because a lot of powerful stuff happened there. There could be a lot of powerful portals and vortexes and everything. And they want people to forget, you know, they want people to forget about ancient Babylon, which is Iraq. and maybe parts of Afghanistan too. They want people to forget about every single piece of history, which didn't occur that long ago as they want us to believe anyhow. So Virgin Mary, Joseph, very religious, believing people who want to do everything right. I don't think they would be people who would question their reality necessarily. I'm just kind of talking in the present tense because it's easier for me. Was there an age gap between them? I don't know. I didn't really get much on that. I'm not sure it really matters for this video. Are they nice? I think so. I think they're nice people. I don't think they were bad people. They had sons, and reports vary. Could have been 4 sons, or like Jesus could have had 4 brothers. And they're also talking about sisters. So it could have been at least 1 or 2 sisters that he had. I know he had at least 1 for sure, because that sister keeps popping up over and over again in other incarnations. I don't want to call her a prostitute. I think there were definitely other prostitutes. And this is where things get a little bit confusing, because there are so many different Marys that are mentioned. So there was a Mary that was a prostitute. And then some people are like, oh, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, especially people who haven't done a whole lot of research. There was another Mary who was a different Mary. There was Virgin Mary. There was Mary Magdalene. There's like 10 million Marys in this entire story. So his sister, I don't think she was a prostitute in that lifetime. Maybe she had loose morals or whatever, but it could have been that she definitely had loose morals in other lifetimes. And so that is for sure the sister that came through the clearest when I started reading on that. The other one, not sure. He definitely had 2 sisters in other incarnations though. So he definitely had brothers though, and there are some theories out there that his one brother, I'm not sure if it was Thomas or a different name, was his twin brother. Didn't necessarily get much on that, let's put it that way, whether or not he had a twin brother. It wouldn't be that far-fetched, let's put it that way. So if he were to be crucified, he would have maybe his twin brother would have been the one who was really crucified or whatever, and he and Mary Magdalene fled after that. They definitely fled though. So however he kind of, I mean, I'm not saying he evaded or avoided the crucifixion, but he definitely kind of made it alive from there. And that is part of the truth of the story, but then it was completely distorted into him resurrecting and all of that. I don't want to say it's BS, but it kind of is, because yeah, so he kind of did survive it somehow. And I'm not sure if it was because he had parts of superpowers that people had back then. By superpowers, I don't mean, you know, supernatural, whatever, but people were more powerful back then than they are now, because people were in a way more spiritual than they are now. So there was this one brother, and I think it's Thomas, I'm not 100% sure. But whoever went ahead and kind of founded a church on his own right after, like supposedly, and I think that was Thomas, he's the person who did not get along with Mary Magdalene, really. So there was a conflict between them both. And them not getting along would definitely play out in other lifetimes as well, but you know, just for the purpose of this lifetime, they didn't really get along. I'm not really sure what conflict exactly happened. So what I do believe happened is that they met somehow, and how exactly is actually also a good question, but it almost seems that from the moment they met, they were pretty much together and intertwined. So it's not necessarily that Mary Magdalene and Joshua met and they were kind of separated at all. It seems like they were kind of together from the time they met, which is very important to note, because in other lifetimes, it seems they met somehow, and then there were maybe even like decades or whatever in between. And yeah, so in that particular story though, they met, and I do believe they are divine counterparts, if you're familiar with that term, for sure. Yes, some people are, some people aren't. And if you're not, then if you don't resonate with that term, then maybe you're not. Some people really are though. So that's why I'm saying you can't speak about one person without mentioning the other person, because they're both part of the same soul. You know, it's definitely part of that narrative. And so they would definitely know what's going on with each other and everything, and would have that very strong connection to each other. They weren't the only ones having that connection, by the way, but since we're talking about them in this video, I do think it's worth mentioning. So there was a wedding that they had, and that's why I know that they were married, and that was before the crucifixion. It wasn't after. It was definitely before anything happened to him or whatever. What I saw, and I saw this like 2 years ago when they married, was the ceremony was relatively small, or maybe not so small for that time, but for this time, I would say it was around 50-ish people, maybe 50, 75 people, whatever. It wasn't like 200. It wasn't, like 100 even. It was a smaller ceremony. She was wearing a very light something. It could have been beige. It could have been white. She looked very happy for sure. He looked very happy as well. There was an officiant or a celebrant, the person who wedded them. I don't want to say priest or whatever, because that doesn't really, I don't think that was a priest, but there was a person who kind of wedded them. And then there was a lot of dancing. It seemed like dancing is always very important in their lives. And back then, and you still see that very clearly in Jewish weddings nowadays too. And a lot of these traditions have carried over, but a lot of traditions have also been forgotten. Like a Jewish wedding, if you've ever taken part of a Jewish wedding, which they were Jewish back then, they weren't Christian. It's a very spiritual experience. And it also goes on for a long time, not just a few hours or whatever. And what's spiritual about it is just all of these rituals and traditions, and just the entire energy is very spiritual. And that's kind of what I saw in their wedding, that it was a very spiritual experience. It wasn't necessarily religious, which makes sense because Jewish weddings in and of itself, they're not necessarily religious unless you go to an Orthodox or Hasidic Jewish wedding. That's different. But in the purity of it, it seemed to be a very spiritual experience. People were happy. People were dancing. They were happy. They were dancing for sure. And their connection was very pure. Their connection to each other was very loving. And they just had, it was just that, that true love type of connection. That's kind of what I saw with them. Now, I do think they also had children, at least one child, if not more. There are reports out there that say they had 2 children, 1 girl, 1 boy. All of that can be true. I definitely know they had at least 1 child though. How and when is still kind of like, I'm not sure if they had that in Israel or when they kind of started traveling. So what I did see was that he had like a pack on or whatever, and they were kind of fleeing together. And it almost felt like they already had like a child with them while they were doing that. Now I do want to point out also, so somehow he escaped the entire crucifixion scenario. Whether or not that was a fabricated scenario, I do think something like that happened, but I'm not sure how exactly he escaped it. Like whether or not he was just powerful enough, had so much willpower that he was able to survive like those 3 days or whatever, at the cross without water in the sun, in the scorching sun and everything. I really don't know what happened exactly, or if it really was like his supposed twin brother that died on the cross instead. But it kind of just felt like he was able to escape it somehow, and that people definitely knew that he was gonna, like, so people knew, like not everyone, but like there was a small handful of people that knew that they were gonna escape. And so there is this one church in Egypt, which is supposedly, I haven't been there yet, but my friend keeps telling me about it because she's Egyptian, which was supposedly founded by Mary and Jesus. And people think it was founded by Virgin Mary and Jesus, but it makes no sense. Like, why would his mother and 3-year-old Jesus found a church? It makes 0 sense. So the only explanation for that would be that he and Mary Magdalene went to Egypt somehow, maybe put up this cross site or whatever in Egypt, and then kind of went on, because there's definitely that connection to France, to the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically stretches from like Italy up to Germany and everything. So that, France, Ireland, England, and then connection to Avalon too. There's also a connection to India somehow, but I'm not sure if that was a different incarnation or whatever. What I did get in a different video, though, is that they could have possibly turned very old, hundreds of years old. Like then I got that he could have very well turned 900 years old. She could have turned like 800 years old if it's really that old, or just like a few hundred years old. There's so many psychic blocks around us, but they were definitely older than the 30 years or even 90 years or wherever she was supposed to be. And I don't think she really died alone, like 30 years alone in a cave in France or whatever. Like that story doesn't really ring true for me, because that's what a lot of Mary Magdalene worshipers think, that she was kind of like carried up every day in the heavens by the angels and everything. No, I think they were actually together for a very long time, and they did a lot of things together. And she has descendants for sure. Those descendants are all over France, Germany, like what used to be the Holy Roman Empire. And he definitely has descendants as well. So that's, in short, I think what I wanted to say about the Jesus story. There is a band out there called the Jesus and Mary Chain, which I think is a really interesting name. It almost implies that they're chained together, right? That's another thing I wanted to point out. With Jesus' family, though, it's not like there's no connection to any of them. Like, family is family, right? So he would have a huge connection to his father. He would have a huge connection to his mother. He would have a huge connection to his brothers, his sisters, whatever. And these would be people he would most likely reincarnate with over and over again in several different lifetimes, right? So that's kind of how soul connections work, how souls recognize each other. So if you're talking about Jesus, you have to like kind of incorporate the entire people that were around Jesus as well. And that kind of, were a very crucial part of his life. And that was his family, that were his brothers, his siblings, his parents, and the friends around him as well. So Jesus would have all these people, call them followers, whatever. I mean, obviously he would have a lot of haters too, as we can tell, but people were kind of enamored by him and what he had to say, because that's kind of how it works with spiritual people. And that's also how it works with targeted people. So souls who are kind of awake and maybe know the key out somehow out of this mess, those would be also the targeted ones. I mean, just the fact that Jesus was kind of targeted from the beginning before he was born. They were already sending people out there to persecute him or kind of get that child. I do think there's a bit of truth with that, because we had a video on the King Herods. There was more than one. And, all of that already says a lot about targeted people. Was he recognized that greatly in his own lifetime? I think there was definitely a form of charm around him, that people, like both men and women, he was very likable in that sense. There was something, when people meet a soul, like I personally noticed that today again too, how people are just like kind of staring at you, right? Especially now that we're in this artificial world almost. When people meet a soul, there's something that automatically draws them to it. And when this soul is kind, compassionate, loving, and has something else to say that kind of speaks to people's souls, then yeah, I do think there are possibilities high that Jesus in that way existed. All right, we're going to leave it at that. It was very difficult to record. I just want to point that out. A lot of distractions thrown this way towards the video's way. But I hope this kind of explains a few things. Once again, it's not a religious standpoint at all. This has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with the distortion that the Bible symbolizes. It has nothing to do with the New Age concept people have about our angels, archangels, Jesus, whatever. When they're channeling Jesus or Archangel Michael or whatever, they're channeling strange imprints or all these entities in the astral that are disguising themselves to be Jesus or Archangel Michael or Archangel Nathaniel or whatever, or ascended masters. So this has nothing to do with that. This has to do with the actual person who was alive, who has a huge connection to his family, who was married to Mary Magdalene. And without Mary Magdalene, there is no Jesus. Without Jesus, there is no Mary Magdalene. They both belong together. So very important. All right, you guys have a wonderful one. Let me know what you think and talk to you very soon. Bye.